As you develop your gouache skills, it's also important to develop your understanding of color and light in the landscape. That's a huge reason I paint outside so often, but when it's freezing out, I will sometimes just paint whatever I can see outside my window. So today I'm going to lead by example and share how I painted this scene with gouache on toned paper. I'll share my strategies for layering gouache in addition to understanding color in the landscape. Let's get started. I'm going to be kind of zooming in on this middle section where the light is hitting the bark on the trees and just where the trees start overlapping the bark. One of the first things I think about is whether or not I want to have any of the paper color showing through, or if I'm going to use opaque paint on top of it. There's so many different ways you could approach it, and I think it looks really cool either way, but more often than not with gouache I'm painting opaquely on top of the toned paper. As I'm staring at the subject outside my window, I'm thinking, what will my highlight colors be, my shadow colors, and I'm making a plan in my head before I even start painting. So let me talk you through how I would make this plan in my head. In this study, I'm focusing on the tree, and well, really it's about the light hitting the tree. That's what really drew me in. That's what got my interest in the first place. So I try to think, okay, how can I simplify everything? I think the easiest thing is to figure out your highlights and shadows for whichever things you're painting, whichever objects or your subject. So in this case, it's the tree trunk, the branches, and the foliage. So I start playing with ideas in my head about what colors would look cool in the highlights and shadows of each of these things. And of course, you can practice color matching what you see in person, or you could put your own artistic spin on it. But no matter what color families you decide to go with, having this plan of action is going to help you develop your painting much quicker. And by the way, the colors I'm using on this palette are my Shinhan and Schminke gouache, which I did a little unboxing and swatching of previously. You can go watch that if you're interested. For the shadows, I decided to go with a deep blue purple instead of black because I wanted them to be a bit more colorful. But even though I'm using a very dark color, gouache has a drying shift. So a lot of times the dark colors dry lighter and the light colors dry darker. So it's advisable to put down a layer of color and then see how it dries, see if you need to add a bit more or if you need to darken it or lighten it. As my brushstrokes get closer to the outer edges of my branches, I'm slowly touching in green as well. This just indicates that the sun is hitting these little bits, but I'm leaving the majority of that background area as a shadow color. Leaving the background darker is what is going to make the tree trunk stand out even more and come forward in the painting. Now, one of the techniques I'm going to use in this painting is called glazing. Glazing is usually a watercolor technique, but you can do it with gouache if you're really careful about your water control. So my gouache isn't purely opaque, it's just ever so slightly thinned down. I'll let this first shadow layer dry, and then I'll come back with a glaze on top of it, and those colors will visually mix together. But of course, gouache reactivates in water, so there will be some physical mixing and blending of the paint. But this is perfect for getting subtle shifts of color. The key to this technique with gouache is to be careful of how much water you're using. If you reactivate too much of the gouache and blend too many colors together, it kind of just turns to mud. So that's another reason that going in with a color plan is super important. I also want to point out that this first layer of color is a bit more on the vibrant side. Because I know I'm going to be coming back with another layer or two of color, I'll be dulling it down slightly, and then in the end adding more and more white, which desaturates my colors. This just ensures that my final painting will have a bit more color and life to it. For the highlight area, I'm going to lay in a bit more of a vibrant orange mixed with a tiny bit of my Venetian red, which is a kind of an earthy red. So this will give me a bright pop of color. Technically, you could just use the color of the paper as your highlight area, but in this case, I just wanted the whole thing to pop off the page. And if you do decide to use the color of the paper as a tone in your painting, you'll need to paint around the edges of it so that it becomes its own isolated color. Otherwise, it just blends in with the background of the paper anyway. I hope that makes sense. So with my highlights, I'm laying in this pop of orange, knowing that I'm going to be coming back in and kind of desaturating it slightly with my next glaze. For the cracks and texture of the bark, I'm going to be using strong vertical lines, mostly with a dark bluish tone. This color could easily be the same one as the background shadow tones. And for the second layer on the highlight, I'm using kind of a dull peachy tone. I'm dragging it up slightly past the edges of where I initially set down the highlights, so it kind of goes on top of the shadow a bit. And when it dries, because it's not fully opaque, it's going to let a bit of that shadow peek through, and it'll just create a nice visual blend between the two. And this is the same strategy I use for the rest of it. So I continue to layer these little glazes on top of each other, and as they dry, they visually mix together. So it's not that you're necessarily mixing every single color you see in the final painting, but because the undercolors show through just a tiny bit, it's creating a lot of natural blending. Let's talk about color in trees really quick. When the sun is hitting the tree directly, it gives a bright highlight. Sometimes it even appears white compared to whatever is behind it. But there's also a really cool thing that happens when the sun is bouncing off of tree trunks onto other tree trunks. If the tree trunk is generally a warmer color, the light bounces off and reflects off of the nearby trunks and creates a really warm glow effect. So instead of just using bright whites or really light colors as your highlight, you could use an almost luminous orange or peachy tone. This is especially true for pines, where the bark is often more of a reddish or orangish color. So that's one reason I'm glazing this pinkish salmon color over my highlights and shadow areas, especially on the lower part. But again, it's important to do this little by little because it's so easy to reactivate your paint or go a little bit too far and create muddy colors. And finally, I'm going to add a bit of a glare effect on the highlight of the bark. So I'm using a bit of white, which will desaturate and lighten my colors. I'll start by laying it on the brighter part of the bark where the highlights are, but I can also drag this over the shadow side as well. And as it blends with the color that's underneath, it turns a little bit more grayish. And as I do that, I can also start shifting it towards a bluish version of it, because even in the shadow area, we'll have a variation of values. Speaking of shadows, I'm now going to do the under layer or shadow part of my foliage that will be on the top. So instead of using the same color as the background, I'm actually using a slightly darker version. This dark shadow will make that background shadow appear a bit more luminous, or like there's more light bouncing around underneath the tree, whereas this shadow that's happening right below the brightest part of the foliage is meant purely to brighten the foliage, because values are all relative. So when I use this dark shadowy tone underneath the bright pops of green, it's going to make that foliage appear much brighter, like the sun is hitting it with full force. But I want to let it dry completely before I do my final highlights on the foliage. So while I wait, I'm going to start touching in details on the rest of the painting. By now, my study is close to finished, but sometimes these final little details are what really makes it come to life. So these final details can include teeny little highlights here and there, something that extends the value scale of my painting, so maybe a brighter bright or a darker dark. And the reason I do this last is because, well, first of all, it's fun and I like saving the best for last, but also because it's really helpful with gouache especially to let things dry so that you know how bright or dark they are, because remember, there's a drying shift that happens. Okay, remember when I mentioned that there's a lot of variation in values even within our shadows? By mixing up a slightly lighter and more desaturated version of my shadow color and laying it on with thin vertical marks, I'm emphasizing that bark texture with a lighter color. This gives the illusion that there's light bouncing around underneath there, and it brightens that a little bit, but it still indicates as shadow because of the color. This is one of my favorite ways to bring more life to my shadows, and I've shown it many times in past tutorials, including this really detailed gouache tutorial I did about a forest. So if you want more info about this kind of thing, make sure to check out my other tutorials. And if you're finding this video helpful or entertaining at all, I would super appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want to see more, subscribe before you go. Okay, back to the painting and the finishing touches. As I mentioned previously, in order to make something stand out from the background of this toned paper, we need to paint around it. So at the bottom of my tree trunks, where they're just kind of tapering off into nothing, I decided to paint a very dull jade green background color just to make them stand out a bit more. I could have left them as they were, but I just wanted a way to kind of finish and round off the bottom of the painting. But you could use this strategy if you plan on using the toned paper as your tree trunk color. And now for probably the most tedious part. I'm doing the final touches on the foliage above, and because this is an evergreen tree, it doesn't have big leaves, it's full of all these little pine needles. I'm using a flat brush and just touching it one at a time, branch by branch. And of course, this is still a simplified version. It's nothing compared to what I would do if I was going for like hyper realism. But by doing these little vertical and horizontal marks side by side, they sort of give that pine needle shape. It adds a bit of detail. It makes it feel a bit more full up there. And in terms of color, I'm starting with a deeper green and then building up to that bright pop of green. And once again, that's why I did the shadow first, because it's a lot easier to make this look a bit more full of foliage if you vary the values from dark to light. And that's it for this study. I hope you all enjoyed it and maybe learned something or just got inspired to go out there and paint. If you're new to gouache or landscape painting in general, as a reminder, I have tons of tutorials and I'll put some links in the description. But for now, I hope you enjoy painting and I'll see you all again soon. Take care.